The Capitol insurrection took place 205 days ago, and the nation is still grappling with how such a violent attack could have happened in the heart of our democracy. To get to some answers on Tuesday, the House Select Committee investigating January 6th held its first hearing. Lawmakers heard powerful testimony from 4 police officers who defended the Capitol and the people inside.
January 6th, for the first time, I was more afraid to work at the Capitol than my entire deployment to Iraq.
I was electrocuted again and again and again with a taser. I remember thinking there was a very good chance I would be torn apart or shot to death with my own weapon.
The mob of terrorists were coordinating their efforts now, shouting heave, ho, as they synchronized, pushing their weight forward, crushing me further against the metal door frame. One latched onto my face and got his thumb in my right eye, attempting to gouge it out.
One woman in a pink MAGA shirt yelled, "You hear that, guys? This voted for Joe Biden." Then the crowd, perhaps around 20 people, joined in screaming, "Boo!"
Their experiences were heartbreaking and underscored the crisis our democracy faces. At the same time, our nation is also dealing with a deepening health crisis. The pandemic is intensifying as a Delta variant surges. Joining us tonight to discuss all of this are Kelly O'Donnell, White House correspondent for NBC News, Ryan Reilly, senior justice reporter for HuffPost, and Rachel Scott, congressional correspondent for ABC News. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Rachel, I want to start with you. This hearing was remarkable. It was such a heavy day. My question is, talk about the power of what you saw, what we all saw, and what might come of this.
Yeah, you know, I think when the chairman started that hearing, he said that this is not going to be easy. And it really wasn't. I think some of the most striking testimony, you heard it from Officer Dunn, too, where he said, how can this not be political? This was a political rally. It started with a political rally that turned into a riot. You heard the pain in their voices. You saw how visibly upset they still are, being forced to relive those experiences, and all they want is answers. I had an opportunity to talk to Officer Fanone hours before that hearing. He told me that even though he knew it would be hard reliving the pain from that day, that he wanted the truth to get out. And in the middle of that hearing, the brother of Brian Sicknick called me. His name is Craig. He told me he could not bring himself to watch the hearing, that it's so painful for him to see the violence, and he just is left with this answer of why. Why did this happen, and how can we prevent it?
Why? It's such a good question, Kelly. You were nodding your head. When I think about Officer Dunn, I think about the fact that he compared what happened to a hitman and said, if a hitman sent this crowd out or sent someone to kill someone, that person, of course, the hitman would go to jail, but so would the person who hired them. Talk a bit about the accountability here and the idea that there might not be accountability or there will be accountability, and what impact might this have on former President Trump?
Well, I was at the rally that day where then President Trump was talking with the crowd. And one of the things that struck me as I was beginning to walk with the crowd, they were saying he's coming with us to the Capitol. When as a White House reporter, I already knew the president was going to be heading back to the White House. He would not be going there. There was a link between the people who attended that rally and ultimately went to the Capitol and what their expectations of then President Trump were. I think one of the things we'll have to look for is the power of the subpoena. What will this committee be able to do beyond the emotion we saw from these officers, which was vivid and visceral, and gave us, we've seen so much of this from a wide-angle view of all that violence and all that noise at the Capitol, and they made it so personal and so individual. But what comes next, I think, is will they be able, through subpoena power, to get documents that tell us about what happened inside the White House that day, who spoke to President Trump, what was happening there? Will there be witnesses from that administration, people the president spoke to who will provide testimony when the committee convenes again? Will that give us a window into what was happening? Could the president at that time have done more? Was he given the sufficient warnings? There are plenty of people saying that's certainly the case, and that he did not send help in an urgent way, in fact, watched it as sort of a spectacle. And so I think the subpoena is the thing to watch going down the line.
And I want to ask you a quick follow-up, which is, after 9/11, the terrorist attacks, we saw these real pushes to prevent another attack like this from happening. Do you think that this committee, someone who's covered Capitol Hill for a long time, do you think this committee might get to that point where we could actually prevent future January 6th?
It's so hard because there is such a fragile and volatile political mix right now. I think part of what those rioters had was the element of surprise, much like 9/11. Now we know from being in Washington and anyone who visits here as part of their summer vacation, much harder to get close to the Capitol. So there are hardened defenses that exist now. But are there ongoing threats to democracy? Very definitely. And if this committee can shine a light, can try to expose what really happened, and maybe some of those who were swept up in it, who were not those charged with what was happening there, but just swept up in it, even as observers from afar, maybe they will have a better understanding or insight about how fragile our democracy can be.
Well, Ryan, we had to, of course, have a justice reporter on this week. Talk a bit about the fact that these people, some of them are being tracked down by online sleuths, some of them are being charged, but we also heard officers call them terrorists, but they're not being charged with terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is I think that people don't always have the best understanding of what domestic terrorism means exactly. Basically, what that means is that it's something that's motivated by something here. So when people designate between foreign terrorism and domestic terrorism, what they're really talking about is the underlying ideology. So with foreign terrorism, that essentially operationally boils down to being Islamic extremist groups. Domestic terrorism is much more broad, and there's not actually a specific law on the books that bans domestic terrorism outright. After someone is sentenced under another federal charge, they can give sort of a little bit of a boost in their sentencing because it's a domestic terrorism case, but that's not actually what they're charged with. So the Justice Department is going to be very judicious about when they use the term domestic terrorism, because if you look back at our history, obviously, in the past, throughout the history of the FBI, throughout the history of the United States, the term terrorism has been used in very awful ways against political enemies. So that's something that I think the Justice Department is going to be very careful about and make sure that they have the facts lined up before they come out and say this person's a terrorist.
And before the hearing on Tuesday, a group of Republican lawmakers blamed Speaker Pelosi for the Capitol attack.
On January 6th, these brave officers were put into a vulnerable and impossible position because of the leadership at the top has failed.
The American people deserve to know the truth, that Nancy Pelosi bears responsibility as Speaker of the House for the tragedy that occurred on January 6th.
Now, to be clear, those claims are false. On January 6th, the Capitol Police were responsible for the security of Congress. But Ryan, I'm going to turn to you. What's the actual truth here? Break that down a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, that's just not the case. There's a little bit of a distance between the oversight of the Capitol Police. There's an oversight board. And, what they're not mentioning here, of course, is there's two components to Congress, right? We all learned this in grade school. There's the House and there's the Senate. And together, those two organizations are in charge, the heads of those two organizations. And who's in charge of the Senate? Who was in charge of the Senate at that point? Of course, Mitch McConnell. So that's what Republicans are, of course, leaving out here. This idea that Nancy Pelosi is somehow in charge of the entire Capitol Police system is just false.